Okay, right. We're gonna try and do. I'm gonna try and do a little video demonstration tutorial, I suppose. This is extremely weird. I've never done this before. That'll become patently obvious throughout the course of this. We're going to go over how to create a turntable for our character, a turntable animation. What is a character turntable animation? I've got, I did a little image search just to remind myself. Character turntable. It's how we are going to present our 3D models. We're going to present our 3D models. Let's have a look at the modeling filter here. We're going to present our 3D models on a little stand like this. And we're going to animate the rotation of the character in the stand, so that we can see, all the 360 degrees around our character. This is a kind of very common industry standard presentation format for our characters. I could go onto YouTube and find an actual video of one of these, but I'm not going to bother. I think you get the idea. So let's have a look. So here's my character. What we're going to do. You may be in a situation like this where you have a character with costume elements or props which are not actually part of the main mesh. So the first thing we've got to do to that character is we've got to join them all together. So we can either select them all and do Control J, and that will join all those bits together into one mesh object. But I and you may want to keep these separate, so that later on you can, I don't know, you might want to work on them. It might be easier to work on them. I find it easier often to keep these things as separate elements for various reasons. So anyway, we're going to set up what's known as a parent and child relationship between all the separate bits and one object that we define as a parent. In this case, we're going to use the main mesh, and we're going to select all of these. Hang on, before I do that, this is it. We're going to turn on the screencast keys, and hopefully, there you go, you can see the keys that I'm pressing. So I'm going to select all of my individual elements. The heads are separate as well. Top there, the trousers, the gloves and the boots. And then I'm going to select the mesh last. You can see that the mesh that was selected last has a kind of yellow outline rather than orange. That means it's the active object. That's the object that was selected last. And we're going to hit Control P, and we're going to set parent to object. So that is defined the last selected object as the parent, and everything else is children. So when I grab the parent, everything else follows, but these are still essentially separate bits. So let's just check that. That's all good. And then we're going to set up that stand. So to set up the stand, we want to. I'm just going to create a cylinder underneath a flat cylinder that we can that he can stand on more confidently. So Shift A to add a cylinder, but we want to add the cylinder right in the center of this guy here. So with the guy selected, if we do Shift S, and choose Snap, Shift S for the snap options, and choose Cursor to Selected, and the 3D cursor will snap to the selected object. And then when we do our Shift A to add our cylinder, it will appear right at the center. Now it's too small to be seen at the moment. I'm going to bring up my toolbar and change the vertices of the cylinder to 8, because we want a fairly low poly cylinder here. Let's get rid of that, and then let's move it down on the Z axis and scale it up. Let's have a look at what we've got. That looks alright. So let's scale it on the Z, flatten that down. That looks pretty good. And let's line it up with the bottom of his feet. That'll do nicely. Let's have I'm going to embed the feet slightly there just to make sure there are no gaps. Don't want to see any weird hovering shadow type things. Right. Okay, there we go. Now we could just parent the character to the stand now. Also, by the way, you guys are going to be designing the stand. I want you to think about the location, the environment that your animation takes place in, and try and design a stand, something that's actually relevant to the character itself. Think about the shape of it and the textures, materials that you're going to use, that kind of thing. Okay, that's quite a nice example of this character on a shield. That's the sort of thing we're aiming for, right? Where you're actually going to design the stand itself. But for the purposes of this little demonstration, I think we'll keep it fairly simple and straightforward. That's looking pretty good. So next thing we want to do is we're going to parent the character to the stand, and we'll animate the stand, and the character will follow. So selected the character, selected the stand, Control P, let's set parent to object again. You'll notice you get that dotted line, that indicates there is a parent-child relationship there. If I move this away, you know, there's a line connecting our parent and our child. So grab that, everything else is following. Right, now this next stage is not entirely necessary, but I think it is good practice. We could just animate the stand now. We could just animate the stand rotating on the z-axis, and that would be fine. But I'm going to go one extra step and add in an empty. An empty is literally an invisible object, an invisible object which, you know, is used quite a lot to control other objects in animations, in games particularly. We can use an empty to hold data, for example, in a game. But anyway, we're going to use this plane axis. There are various different looks that we can have to our empty. We're going to choose plane axis, move it down to the bottom here, and we're going to parent everything to this empty. So we're right-clicking on our last parent, shift right-clicking on the empty, Control P, set parent to object. So now we can pick him up, and everything else follows. So yeah, I think this is best practice. You know, if we need to add anything else to the scene, for example, we can parent it to this empty. Right, so we're going to animate this empty now, rotating around the z-axis, this blue arrow here in the middle. So we need to come down and have a look at the timeline. This is the first time I imagine that you've dealt with the timeline. This is it down here. You know, it is in the kind of default layout of Blender. So what have we got down here? By default, you will actually have 250 frames there. We have a green playhead. This line here, this band is the playhead, and then we have time represented horizontally here. And we have frames. If I zoom right in, we can zoom in on the timeline with the scroll wheel. We can kind of scroll along with the slider here, or we can use the same controls we do in the 3D view and shift middle mouse button around. But we can see now that we've zoomed in, we've got, zoom in a little bit further, we've got, you know, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got, these are all individual frames. And we're going to add keyframes to the timeline. A keyframe is like a marker which defines a start point or an end point of some kind of movement, some kind of transition. Okay, let's zoom that out a little bit. And we're going to keyframe the rotation value of this empty. In Blender, much like in After Effects, we can come back. We can animate various different values. We can animate the scale of an object, the rotation, the location, all sorts of things. Anything that is basically anything that has a value, we can animate. I don't know about the location of the 3D cursor, but we can animate anything that most things that have a value. And we're going to animate the Z rotation of this empty. So we need to add a keyframe at the start point. Like I said, keyframe defines the start and the end point. So we've got our playhead at frame 1 here, and we're going to keyframe the value of the Z, the value of the rotation on the Z axis of this empty. So playhead at 1, we are going to insert a keyframe here. So we've got the empty selected. So we're right click on that value there. Hover over it, right click and choose insert single keyframe. If you choose insert keyframes, it keyframes the values across the whole of this kind of field here, X, Y and Z. But that's a little bit extravagant. We just want to choose insert single keyframe, and we are keyframe that one value. So it's turned yellow to indicate that it has a keyframe there. I'm going to be using the word keyframe a lot. And we have a yellow band on the title, a yellow line here on the timeline, and that's telling us where, at what point in the timeline the keyframe is. And you'll notice if I come off, if I select anything else, that disappears. This is only the empty that has the keyframe on it, and it's keyframe the rotation value. So that's the start point, 0 degrees. That's locked in, that's keyframes. So we've got to move the playhead to an appropriate point. Now in the timeline, think about how long you want this animation to be. If we're dealing with 24 frames per second, then we've got about 4 seconds in 100 frames. That's probably pretty fast. Let's move the playhead to frame 200, and then let's change the value of our rotation now at this point. So we can just left click to get into there, and 360 degrees. And then we need to keyframe that. It's green at the moment to indicate there's a keyframe somewhere. There is that keyframe at frame 0, but there's not a keyframe yet here. So right click, insert single keyframe, turns yellow. We've got a yellow line here, the timeline. And if we scrub back here with the playhead, we can see it animating that rotation. In the timeline, we can use Alt-A as the hotkey for play. You can access the play, pause controls down here. We'll talk about all of this timeline stuff when we start getting to animation in more detail now. You'll notice, amongst other things, that the playhead continues after that last keyframe. That's no good to us. We want it to zip back to the beginning and create a little loop. We can have as many frames here. This grey section defines the frame range that exists in this Blender file. In the moment it's 250 frames. We can have as many frames as we want, but we want it to zip back at 200, so we want to change the end frame from 250 to 200. And we can do it here, or we can do it up here. Either way, it's the same thing. So we change the end to 200. You can see that happening. And now if we Alt-A, it zips back. So the second thing you'll notice is how it starts off slow, speeds up in the middle. I mean, it's going to be fairly tricky to tell with the lag that you're getting and the 20 frames per second that we're getting here. But it's fairly clear, and when it's rendered, it'll be very noticeable. And it's it's the default setting. It looks a bit shabby. I don't like it very much. So we're going to change that. We're going to change our timeline to the graph editor. By the way, I had to change my screen resolution to a ridiculous 1024 by 640 to decrease the lag that was being created by the screen recording. So everything has been crammed in a very tight space. So I'm having to use the scroll wheel occasionally on the menu options to get to what I need. So I'm going to change the timeline window to the graph editor. The graph editor is a kind of visual presentation, a visual representation using curves, using a graph, a representation of the interpolation, the how one keyframe transitions into the other. So this is keyframe, the first keyframe we added at frame 1. If I zoom out from miles and just pan down, you'll see, I'll keep zooming, you'll see the frame 200 away up here, and there's a curve in between. That curve, and we can play about that curve and change that interpretation if we want, and make, have a different speed happening here. But we don't want that. We want to change it from this curve to a linear speed, a constant speed from frame 1 to frame 200. So with the frame selected, hit T for interpolation. Don't worry too much about these definitions just now. We're going to change it from Bezier to linear. Accidentally hit constant. Constant will just snap from 0 degrees to 360. There'll be nothing in between. So that's no good. We're going to do that again. Make sure we choose linear, and then come back out the graph editor, I'll go back to this basic timeline, and let's see if you can tell the difference. Right, so that's a bit better. It's just going to be a constant speed, so it's going to loop seamlessly. And there we go, seamless. Right, next thing, we need to set up a camera. Obviously, or possibly not that obvious, if you, when we render this, when we kind of export this as a little movie, we export, it renders through the camera. And at the moment, my camera is, I think that's it over there. My camera, if I hit Z on the numpad, is looking off into space. So we need to position this camera in front of our character. I'm going to put the timeline, the playhead back to frame 1, and I'm going to hit 1 to go into front orthographic. So you want to get yourself in a position where you're looking straight at the front of your character at the beginning of your animation, and we're going to align our camera up with this view. So there's lots of ways we can do that. We could just drag it around and eyeball it and get it in position, but I like to select the camera, get into a view that I want, and choose from the view menu here, align view, and align the active camera to the view. It's also Control Alt and 0. Now that hasn't worked, but it's close enough. I can just drag it on the y-axis back a little bit and check that out. Right. So I need some further tweaking. But what I have noticed is that my camera is in perspective mode, so I don't really want that. For the purpose of this character presentation, I don't want distortion created by perspective. So I'm going to go into orthographic view, an orthographic camera, and I'm actually going to change the dimensions of this as well. I don't like that rectangle. I want square. So I'm going to go for the Instagram resolution 1080 by 1080. Right, it's still not perfect. I've got a nice square, but it's slightly off center, so we can tweak this a couple of ways. We could, so I've got the camera selected, I'm in camera view. I could just move its location on the x-axis here by using the slider, left clicking and sliding to move it into the center. That's probably the best way of doing it. Let's do that. Right, so that's it centered in our camera. So Alt A, let's check that out, not bad. I might move it down a little bit, so we could use the Z-axis, we could just drag the Z-axis, but I keep reminding you of this lock camera to view option under the view settings. If we tick that, we get the red dots around our camera, and then we can use our regular 3D view navigation tools, so shift and middle mouse button to pan around, and it's not panning, it's actually moving the camera. So let's get it centered and then switch that off again. And that looks alright. Let's see it from the front. Fine. It's centered, it's square. Last thing, this has taken far too long. So let's move on. Next thing, lights. I'm in Blender render. Let's just do a Shift Z to check how that's rendering. Right, I've got no lights in here, and that's quite nice if we're thumbnailing, if we're doing silhouettes, but we're not, so we need some lights. The first thing we could do, a really easy thing we could do, is go into the world settings and turn on ambient occlusion. Now, ambient occlusion will, there we go. Ambient occlusion will give us some ambient occlusion shadows, and to do that it creates this kind of general overall kind of lighting situation to produce the ambient occlusion light, so that's quite nice. That'll probably do. What I would like you guys to do though is actually set up a 3-point light system. So I want you to have a light, a lamp looking at the front of your character, a lamp coming from the side, and maybe one from above or from the back to create that standard kind of portrait 3-point light setup. This kind of deal. Okay, so camera looking at our character. So normally we have a key light, which is the main light, a fill light that's filling up the shadows created by the key light, so it will not be as strong, and then one from the back to get a kind of rim light effect. coming through around the edge. Key light, fill light is filling those shadows, so it's giving us a little bit of light on the shadow side, and then a backlight is what's creating this rim light here around the top of his hair. So I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go into setting up lights just now because this has hit the 20-minute mark. Ambient occlusion, and then add some lamps to your scene, and then it's a case of rendering. I'm not going to go through rendering now either. We'll do that at a later date. So get your turntable set up, ready to go, and we will go through rendering. All the best with that.